been a little while since I've talked about Euphorbias on this channel, but really I shouldn't have delayed because they're such a fantastic genus of plants. I'm going to be talking about them today through the lens of collecting because just like Pokemon, you've got to catch them all. It is a genus with over 2,000 different species of all sorts of different types. And if we're zeroing in just on the succulent varieties, there's more than 800. And so there's always something else to add to your collection, especially when scientists decide to start throwing more and more plants under the Euphorbia umbrella. So today, join me as we go on a bit of a deep dive looking at, well, as many of the varied plants as I can possibly share with you that exist in my Euphorbia collection. I'm hoping that this isn't just going to be a fairly aimless wander through my collection though, because I do have a few points that I'd like to talk about. Things like what you can do to ensure the survival of your collection. Things to avoid, ethically I suppose, when it does come to collecting these plants. And just the wonderful and bizarre variety that we can find across the span of this delightful genus of plants. When I first started growing cacti and succulents, I had a bit of a negative impression of Euphorbias. They felt like they were a bit of the poor man's cactus for whatever reason. And you can see that likeness to cactus, especially when you look at a plant like this one. This is Euphorbia canariensis from the Canary Islands, because that growth form is very much like a columnar cacti. And there's all sorts of Euphorbias that have this same rough appearance. Tall growing, green, with spikes up the stem. It's no wonder that people who were first joining the hobby really do get them confused. But it belies the incredible and insane variety that we find. And so I think that's where we're going to go first. Not just looking at plants like this one that have a very cactus-like appearance, but the whole breadth of insane variation that you can find across all the continents where these plants grow. But before we start looking at any of the real crazy plants, let's establish their cactus-like credentials, hey? And what better way to do it than look at these two very closely related plants. This is a Euphorbia horrida, and this one is a Euphorbia polygona. Like I said, they're closely related, and you can see why. This is just kind of a spiky version of this one. But both of these are from southern Africa, and really they represent everything about Euphorbias that makes people confuse them with cacti. If you didn't know any better, you would be forgiven for assuming, of course, that these are just different varieties of cactus. But of course that's not the truth. Now, how is it that these plants can look so similar to cacti and not be them? It's all to do with that idea of convergent evolution. Cacti in the Americas facing very similar kind of climatic conditions to what Euphorbias in the Africas experience, and evolution in all its wonder results in these plants growing into almost identical sorts of forms. Really kind of remarkable and a reflection of the absolute majesty of nature, I suppose. Anyway, both of these plants are beautiful, absolutely stunning, especially this one. How good's that thick white farina? It's like a heavy waxy coating that prevents these plants from burning too heavily in the sun. It's a real showstopper, one of my favourites. That's why it's been potted up in this fancy pot. You can see that happening on a video I released a few months ago. Anyway, I've got a few more that are a bit cactus-like, so let's have a look at them as well. So we're sort of staying in that same theme at the moment, and both of these plants as well, they're very closely related to the past two that I just showed you. This one here is called Euphorbia stellospina. Stella as in star, because if you look at the spines on it, which are quite fascinating, they sort of emerge into this sort of star shape. It's a really interesting variation on the theme. This one is Euphorbia mammillaris. This is actually the variegated form, commonly known as the corncob cactus, because when you zero in on its ribs, there's all these little bumps, little tubercles, which I suppose, if you squint just right, give it a bit of an appearance of a corncob. Now, they're both spiny, they're both elongated, they're both succulents, and they're both plants that I reckon anyone could be forgiven for thinking that they're cacti. But this starts also bringing in that wonderful notion of variegation, because a lot of these plants do have variegated forms as well, which is really delightful. I love both of these plants, probably this one as an absolute favourite. Had a sad moment a few years ago when a rat chewed on the growth point, but it's kind of starting to recover, and I think now that sort of weird indentation just gives it a bit of gnarly character. And I love plants with a bit of gnarly character. They remind me of me. But you know what? They don't actually all look like cacti, and that's where collecting these plants starts becoming so joyfully rewarding. This guy here, you might be surprised to find out that it is also extremely closely related to those other plants, to the point you can actually hybridize them. This is called Euphorbia buplerifolia, and as you can see, it kind of looks a bit like a pine cone, not so much a cactus, but a pine cone with a little tuft of leaves coming out of the top. Delightful plants, absolutely joyful. I've heard some people describe them as difficult to grow, but they thrive in my conditions in this greenhouse. They love it, absolutely love it. And these guys are just, to me, exemplary of how they can start to spiral out into a bit of weirdness, a bit of madness. Euphorbia buplerifolia was probably one of my earliest really strange members of the Euphorbia genus, and now I just grow them. I grow them from seed all the time, bring them up, lots of little ones. I have a big old mama plant up the back there that I didn't want to get off the shelf in case I dropped it. But this guy, this is like second generation Euphorbia buplerifolia, and it's doing really well. But then backtracking for a moment, you go and get a plant like this one, Euphorbia susannae, which rather than looking like one of those tall columnar cacti, is more like one of your low growing, ground hugging, clumping cacti, like Echinopsis, for example. But the thing that's just so wonderfully delightful about these two plants, again, they're so closely related that you can hybridize them. And you know, going off on a little bit of a tangent for a second, if we're thinking about being a collector, and maybe 800 species is just not enough for you, there's also a whole world of delightful hybrids that you can just get sucked down the rabbit hole for. Let me show you. We'll start with the babies of this one, and then I'll show you a couple of other interesting hybrids as well. Because when you cross Euphorbia susannae with Euphorbia buplerifolia, you get this great little cultivar called Euphorbia japonica, which merges the best features of both of them. You get that clumping little habit of the susannae with the cute little pine cone nature of the buplerifolia, and you end up with this guy, sometimes known as Euphorbia cultivar pineapple head. And I guess I can see why that's the case. Really joyful little plants, and they're super easy to propagate as well. You just need to snip off one of these little heads, chuck it in some soil, and after a couple of months there'll be roots and it'll be sending out its own little clumps. And I suppose if you were so inclined, you could create a whole army of them, probably within a year or two. Delightful. And of course not a species, so if you're getting one of these, you're just adding a little extra ticker box to that long list of Euphorbias that you need to hunt down to add to your collection. And if you're really stuck for new plants to start adding, just go about making your own hybrids. This one here, this is one of my favourite plants. I just think the colouring is so delightful. Have a look at this. It's got this thick white waxy farina, and from the top tiny little leaves, but in this case, as they kind of get stressed in the winter, they turn a really wonderful pinkish red, and that contrast, the pinks against the reds, against the whites and the green, all with these fantastic kind of ridged body, just an absolute delight. I'm quite astounded that I created this hybrid from scratch. Parent plants of this, it's got a long, painfully complicated lineage, but you trace it back far enough, buplerifolia and polygona, that white, heavy, thick farinaed plant. And so there is always the opportunity to add new plants because you can just go and breed your own. This one doesn't yet have a name. Maybe in time I'll think of something. Maybe you have an idea. What should I call this particular cultivar, this weird little hybrid? I think it's a real beauty, and it probably deserves better than being called Euphorbia bup x poly F1, which is what it's currently called. Now I'm just going to interrupt proceedings because I want to share with you some really cool new merch that I've got, and I thought you guys might be interested in. I've got these aversion sweatshirts, or jumpers as we call them down here in Australia. There's 2 of them. And of course it's winter down here, so this reflects my part of the world. You've got the winter dormant Adenia petuelii jumper, and then maybe you're a little bit more active in the cooler months. You've got the winter active Pachypodium namaquanum sweatshirt. There's a link on the screen if you're interested. You can check them out. I make this merch because I like to wear it, and seemingly a lot of people who watch this channel enjoy it just as much as me. So I put it out there for you guys. If you're interested, go check it out. Now you can really start splitting hairs when it comes to collecting these things. For example, this is Euphorbia obesa, called the baseball euphorbia or baseball plant because its growth form in time just turns into this nice fantastic round ball. This, on the other hand, is not a Euphorbia obesa. This is Euphorbia symmetrica. And, well, to my eye, they look very, very similar indeed. And its growth form is almost identical. But where they differ primarily is in how they flower. This one will have flowers sort of more emerging from the top, and this one grows its flowers almost in lines emerging from the center. These guys usually stay a little bit flatter, where these are usually a little bit more round. But like I said, if you want to just split hairs and get yourself a collection of plants that look very similar, that's something that's very easy to do. Or you can just go absolutely hog wild and get a complete insane diversity. Because in contrast to your Euphorbia obesa, you've got a plant like this one, Euphorbia dofarensis, which is nominally a shrub. But really, to me, it's more like just a bundle of green sticks erupting out of the ground. Fantastic, very strange, and very, very different to, I would say, both cacti and those other types of euphorbias. There are quite a few that have a similar growth form. Amongst them, Euphorbia tiricale. You'll see I've talked about that one in my poisonous succulents video, talking about the fairly noxious sap that it exudes. Make you go blind if you're not careful. But anyway, bundles of sticks is just one of the growth forms, but there's so many others as well. At this particular juncture, I was going to show you some plants that didn't look like bundles of sticks. Then I found this one. This is Euphorbia platyclada, which takes that idea of a bundle of sticks and applies it almost completely literally to the point that it's brown and looks fairly dead. Now the funny thing about this plant is that it actually copped a pretty severe sunburn. Sometimes these things happen in autumn with my greenhouse. It's just the nature of how it's set up. And so as a result, some of it actually is dead. And differentiating the living parts from the dead parts is quite difficult just by the nature of the plant. I know it's alive because it's actually flowering at the moment. Quite remarkable. But you want to talk about strange and wonderful plants that look like bundles of sticks. Well, you don't need to go any further than Euphorbia platyclada. But now let me actually show you some plants that do look different to a bundle of sticks. Here's two, and they couldn't look any more different than if you tried. This one is Euphorbia rudis, which is a member of what is called the Medusoid Euphorbias. Medusoid as in Medusa, as in snakes coming out of a central point, like the classical Greek figure of Medusa. Over time, what will happen is that this head here will kind of split into many heads, all growing in the same way, and it will kind of resemble that sense of a whole bunch of snakes. But the animal theme continues, because this one here, this is called Euphorbia pachydermis. Now, pachy as in fish, and dermis as in skin. Let's call it Euphorbia fish skin if you like. Euphorbia pachydermis is incredibly unique amongst the Euphorbias, because when you look at it closely, it looks like it's covered in a layer of fish scales, which is just super, super weird. These plants are reputed to be quite difficult growing on their own roots. That's the reputation they carry with them. but I've had no problems whatsoever. And fascinatingly, over the last growing season, it started growing all of these heads out of the top, which in time I suppose is just going to get bigger and bigger. It's going to be like a little clump of fish-skinned babies. How wonderfully weird is that? Now, I was talking about convergent evolution earlier, about how these plants have kind of evolved over time to look very similar to cacti. Now this is just a very little plant. It's a seedling, a painfully slow-growing seedling, mind you. But this is called Euphorbia gymnocalycioids. And if you are familiar with cacti, that name might sound familiar. Gymnocalycioides actually means it looks like a gymnocalycium, and gymnocalycium is one of those genus of cacti. So named because it kind of has these chin-like tubercles that grow over the plant body. Now, isn't it fascinating that a plant like this, thousands of kilometres away from where any gymnocalycium habitat exists, can grow into what is almost exactly the same form? Wonders never cease as far as I'm concerned. In sharing all of that diversity, we've neglected an entire region of plants that look utterly different. I'm talking about the leafy caudiciform euphorbias that grow in Madagascar. Plants like this Euphorbia francoisii and this Euphorbia ambovombensis, which, as you can see, grow with these thick, fleshy, succulent leaves emerging from a succulent trunk, and often with an underground root storage organ or cortex that can be raised to look fantastic. They're highly collectible plants. Caudiciform lovers absolutely adore these things. Now, there's a whole variety of them that I can share with you. Plants such as Euphorbia ramina. At this one it's dormant, no leaves because it's winter time, but it is flowering, and that's pretty cute. So named because it's got a fairly hairy stem, really weird. And then you've got Euphorbia hediatoides, which kind of has that same bundle of sticks effect, except in this case has leaves on the end. But you can see that raised, fattened root. Really, really fascinating growth. This is going to continue growing a massive, big, fat, round cortex underground as well. And in time, lifting it up will make that thing a real showstopper. Absolutely incredible. And occasionally people will say to me, what's probably the rarest Euphorbia you've got in your collection? And it does sit in that leafy Madagascan space. And at the moment it just looks a bit like an empty pot. This pot's got two plants of a species called Euphorbia nardiae inside it. I think it's a very confused plant. It's caudiciform and it grows leaves, and ostensibly it's a summer grower, and I typically find that it has to wait until the very peak of summer, when the days here in Sydney get to their absolute maximum, for it to start growing. And yet here, right now, for some reason, in the depths of winter, when our temperatures have been falling to some of the lowest I can remember, decided to start putting out leaves again. What is it doing? I have no idea. Do any of us really understand our plants? Probably not. I know I certainly don't, and here I am standing up in front of a camera talking all about them to you guys. And of course I reckon I would have a very angry audience indeed if I didn't talk about this granddaddy of the collection. This is my Euphorbia abdelkuri. Comes from a little island off the coast of Socotra in the Indian Ocean, and in my opinion it is easily the most bizarre and the most wonderful of all of the Euphorbias. It used to be exceptionally rare in cultivation, but there's been a lot of breeders, especially in Asia, who have been just pumping out these bad boys, and now they're pretty easy to find in the market. Aren't they just a delight? Look at that appearance. That thick, waxy stem takes that appearance almost of, I don't know, concrete, waxy concrete, I don't know. And if I was to cut it open, where most Euphorbias have this white latex, this thick white sap, this one, its latex is so thick and so caustic, it's yellow. And it stinks. It stinks. It almost smells like it's burning your nostrils. Delightfully weird and strange. I absolutely love it. And in time, this plant will clump up. It'll get many, many heads. You can actually see almost like growth rings on this plant since I got it. Each time there's a little indentation. That sort of shows a period of time that it's experienced growth. So this top portion here is what it grew over our last summer. Fantastic plant, and I'm actually surprised at how relatively easy it is to grow on its own roots. No troubles whatsoever, at least not yet. But here's the delightful thing, right? Let's say you're closing in on that big, grand 800-ish plus number of species. I don't know how you do it because some of these plants are highly obscure. But botanists, scientists, biologists, every so often they go a little bit mad, and what they do is they change taxonomy. What I mean by that is they lump new plants into the Euphorbia genus. For example, there used to be a whole group of plants called monodeniums, closely related to Euphorbias. In fact, so closely related that now they're all Euphorbias themselves. For example, this plant here, this used to be called Monodenium richii. Wonderful little clumping thing, which when it's in active growth, it's got little sprays of leaves coming out of the top. This is a variegated form, and it's got some really wonderful pink winter stress colours. What a delight to grow, right? But it's not a monodenium anymore, it is a Euphorbia. Euphorbia richii is what this plant is now known as, because like I said, those scientists, in all their deep knowledge, have decided it's so closely related that it can just go into the big genus itself. And so that's the joy of collecting Euphorbias. It seems as though the genus is ever expanding. And so there's always more plants to go and find if you're curious and you're driven in your collection. But if we're talking about being driven as collectors, we have to be aware, in my opinion anyway, of a few red lines that I don't think are worth crossing. Certainly, they're red lines that I'm not going to cross in my pursuit of ever more Euphorbias. And that red line for me is all about poached plants. There is one species of Euphorbia which to my knowledge is only available in cultivation as a poached plant, and that's Euphorbia rapulum. Comes from high up in the Himalayas in the Asias. Relatively common in habitat. Beautiful thing. It has kind of this spray of leaves coming out of an underground cortex. And when it's displayed online, those leaves, which kind of have a bluish green hue, are often marketed as the flowers, but that's not the case at all. Now the thing about Euphorbia rapulum, and you might want to disprove this to me, but I've never actually seen anyone growing a Euphorbia rapulum in any sort of healthy way. I've never seen them fully leafed out. I've never seen them in flower. They usually look like a little cortex sitting there doing almost nothing, occasionally struggling to send out a leaf or something. Why that is, maybe it's to do with that transplantation process, getting ripped out of habitat and put into someone's pot or garden. You know, they may not travel all that well. The second thing is, these things are alpine plants. They come from the Himalayas. And I imagine, I don't know, because there's almost no information about how to successfully cultivate them, but I can speculate that the conditions that they require to grow successfully are probably quite hard to mimic in cultivation. I don't know. If you've been able to grow a Euphorbia rapulum successfully, get it to leaf out, get it to flower, get it to look like the ones as they're growing in habitat, I'd love to know what you're doing. And I'd also love to know if you've managed to get your hands on seed-grown ones, because from what I've seen, all the plants available in the market, to my knowledge, are plants that are taken straight from habitat. And of course, collecting plants isn't like growing anything else. Let's say, for example, you grow heavy metal vinyl records. Unless something catastrophic happens, once you buy a record, it stays there. You can put it in a drawer, keep it safe, and you'll have it for years, decades, whatever. But plants, they live, they die. So what do we do to maintain our collections? Well, I think a great case study in this is my wonderful little pair of Euphorbia eclonii. These are cordiciform plants from South Africa. Unlike every other of my Euphorbias in my collection, these are winter growing plants. And I've spoken about this on the channel before. I used to have 8 of them. And then in a rash moment of what I can only describe as enthusiastic insanity, one autumn, I noticed them emerging from dormancy and I rushed them from their place at the back of the greenhouse up to the front of the greenhouse in the hopes that a little bit more sun might help them along. And of course, as we know, that's just madness because they all got sunburnt to absolute buggery. And I killed 6 of the 8 plants. Now, these are my 2 remaining Euphorbia eclonii. And last year, this one flowered and it was female. And I was like, that's fantastic to know. But this one didn't. However, I am overjoyed to say that this year, both of them have flowered. I have my female, and this one, as you can see, as denoted by the pollen on all of these little flowers, is a male. And so, to maintain and potentially expand my collection of Euphorbia eclonii, I am making an attempt to create seeds. I've tried to pollinate this one. Hopefully, in the next couple of weeks, we're going to see the swelling of an ovary on this female flower, seed pods develop, which I can then harvest, which I can then sow, which I can then turn into wonderful baby little Euphorbia eclonii. And the threat of whether it be an unexpected weather event or whether it be the threat of my own stupidity, we can alleviate the danger of losing Euphorbia eclonii out of the collection, because these are plants that are almost never available on the market. I was going to leave it at that, and then I realized, you know what? I really should make a comment about the importance of labeling the plants in your collection, because I've got this one here. I actually picked it up from a guy who was downsizing his whole collection of plants. I think he went in a little bit too hard, too early, bit off more than he could chew, because he'd spent thousands of dollars on plants, and yet I could tell when he was offering them for sale, they were all in pretty ill health. Anyway, I picked this thing up from him for cheap, and I have no idea what it is. I didn't label it when I got it. I can't find my conversations with him. I know it's closely related to another species called Euphorbia globosa. It's got very similar flowers. But if you can identify this plant for me so I can stick a label in its pot and be done with it, your help would be greatly appreciated. Because one of the joys of collecting things, at least in my experience, is having a fantastic catalogue of all the things that you do have in your collection. And sadly, this one at the moment is just Euphorbia species unknown. But I'd like to change that. And another one I almost forgot, Euphorbia pachypodioides. That name pachypodioides is a reflection of the fact that it looks a whole lot like a pachypodium, which I know some people truly love. Look at that, that's a Pachypodium gracilius. Imagine this guy if it had leaves out the top. Not too dissimilar. Really cool, hey? And so that's the Euphorbias for you. Not so much a guide, not so much a teachable moment, more so just a wonderful reflection of what is a joyful group of plants to collect. I hope if you're interested in Euphorbias, you found this fascinating, you've found something worthwhile listening to. Maybe you've seen some plants that you weren't familiar with and you can hunt them down now to add to your own collection. Whatever the case, my name is Michael, this is Variegation, and I hope you've enjoyed the experience. I'll catch you next time.